Okay, right now. Good. So thank you very much for being here. We have the great honor to welcome Dr. Jaimie Miller-Friedmann as our speaker today in our webinar, in our Women in Physics webinar. She's a renowned teaching fellow at the School of Law and Social Science at Oxford Brookes University, with a distinguished academic career focus on education, gender equality, and promoting diversity in STEM disciplines. She was research assistant also a lot of years ago, as she said, in Harvard Medical School, because Jaimie is from US, from New York, and she was also a science education specialist from 2006 and 2015 at Harvard University. She was saying that she was teaching physics and biology also. So she has a background in biochemistry, so he knows science from the deep. And now she's more focused on this social science. Also, her work has been published in various academic journals and platforms, contributing valuable insights into the challenge and success of women in science, and in particular, focus on the recruitment and retention of women in scientific disciplines. I think that her paper entitled Being a Physicist, Gender and Identity Negotiation on the Pathways to Become an Elite Female Physicist in the UK has an enormous attention in all of us. And this is the reason that she's here with us to tell this particular and all these studies. And we are truly fortunate to have her share her knowledge and expertise with us today. So I give the floor to Jaimie. So Jaimie, thank you a lot to being here with us, and we are delighted to enjoy your talk. So go ahead. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Potts, for that lovely introduction. I'm going to share my slides with you. Can everybody see? Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to share this research with you, and I hope that it resonates with all of you. If I'm speaking too quickly, please let me know. And if you have any questions whatsoever, just do the little hand raise and I'll stop and chat to you in the midst of what we're doing. So today I'll be going through a background, so the lit review and an explanation of the problem. And then I'll move on to the research methods, which is a description of how I collected the data, then the results, and finally the conclusion. So the background, and I'm sure this is nothing new for anybody here, diversifying physics is a priority, not just to us for social justice and for saying that women should be able to do whatever they want to do, including physics if they want to do it. But also, there are governments around the world who are now saying that diversifying physics is a priority for innovation and for the economy in the future. And there are a lot of governments that are now putting money into recruiting women into physics, but they're not necessarily putting money into keeping women in physics. We also know that bias and discrimination in physics is endemic. It has been there for, well, since the beginning, really, and it hasn't really been something that's decreased with time or with awareness. The bias in physics, the discrimination in physics remains to this day. And even though there have been a number of interventions, programs, and schemes dedicated towards recruiting girls into physics, they've not necessarily had the impact that we would have hoped. So in the UK, we have, in the university setting, we have Athena Swan, we have Project Juno, and we have the Race Equality Charter that are all government schemes that are meant to um, keep checks on faculty to make sure that we're aiming to have a more inclusive, diverse culture, and that we have action plans to make them be that way. And despite the fact that those have been in place, the numbers really haven't changed. So, is physics a boys' subject? Well, I would say no, but the fact is that the epistemology of physics, the way that we understand physics, is in this quasi-religious quest for truth. Um, that's generally how we understand what we're doing in physics. And so we go on this quest for truth, or it's either true or false, right? There's no in between ever. Um, and we assume that there's a certain intellectual transcendence to being able to find the truth. Well, all of that is very caught up with a masculine characteristic. All of that is very masculinized, not just this quest for truth, which is caught up in ancient tales of knights going on quests, but also with religiosity, which is inherently male dominated. Intellectual transcendence, too, is very masculinized in that, first of all, it implies a certain dominance, which we always tend to associate with masculinity, but also intelligence, which we tend to associate with masculinity for better or worse. There's also the problem of the available identities within physics. We have certain identities that are easy to slip into when you're studying physics, and they're very easy for boys to slip into, but not necessarily for girls. So according to Alison Gonzalez, we have three available identities. We have the skilled physicist who is just absolutely brilliant and knows how to do everything automatically. We have the physically skilled physicist who's absolutely incredible working with their hands, but has to spend some time working with their minds. And then we have boys with their toys. And that particular identity is um, boys in physics who just like to play around, but they end up being incredible at physics anyway. The overwhelming characteristic that ties all these identities together is first that these are all masculinized identities, but also that there's a certain amount of innate brilliance that goes along with this. They are just innately intelligent. They don't have to necessarily be taught anything. All of these identities go beyond the need for a classroom teacher. It's sort of inherent. And it's not necessarily anything that's associated with girls. So for right now, what's stopping women from participating in physics? Studies have found that females have a lower self-efficacy in physics, meaning the problem in front of them. So this is the difference between self-efficacy and self-concept. For self-efficacy, it's whether or not you feel like you can solve the problem directly in front of you. And many girls will get a problem in front of them and feel like they have no idea how to do it. They're lost. They also have lower self-concept, which means that they don't feel like they can succeed in the long term in physics. They also report feelings of exclusion and not belonging, not the least of which is that they're not included in study groups, either by the other students or by the professors, which was a problem I had when I was in university. There were five of us, five women in a class of 400, and we were told that we had to be in a lab group together because we would bring the boys down if we were in a lab group with them. Not very encouraging. The girls also tend to have weaker physics identities, meaning they don't necessarily see themselves as physicists, nor do they associate themselves with the subject. And then, of course, we have the age-old gender discrimination and bias. So, what makes this study a little different was I took a look at who does participate. and how they do form a physics identity. So the research that has happened in the past um, tends to look at science identities, but also a fair few at physics identities. And what they found was that a cohesive identity, meaning an identity where you don't have to be a female and then a physicist, but you can be both at the same time, that kind of cohesive identity leads to staying in the field. And this is something that's specific to females, to anybody who's not white, to anybody who's not middle class. They always have to negotiate those separate identities in order to form a more cohesive one. Because for them, the physics identity is always in conflict. Physicists, as an available identity, tend to be male, white, middle class, Christian, um, and physically abled. If you're anything other than that, you're going to have to negotiate those identities in order to feel like you fit in. And these identities are negotiated in several ways. By splitting the identities and being one person or seeing yourself as one person when you're doing physics and another person when you're not. Some will do it by passing, um, by ignoring their other identity, basically, or trying to slip by and fit in, or acting, for example, if you're not white, acting white in order to fit in. There are very few that do this, but some do a multiplicity identity in which they act out everything all at once, and it's overwhelming for everybody around them. But then most, and those in this study, adapt. And they'll form an identity that's slightly different to the available identities, but one that allows them, for the most part, to fit in and feel like they belong. So the research method. Um, the participants were identified, I identified people who would be elite. And the elite people were females who had achieved international fame and had accomplished something major in their careers so that they were international names. Um, Most of them were professors, which in the UK is an earned title. It's not something that you get the moment that you have a faculty position. You have to spend many years and a lot of work earning that title. Um, and then those who were not professors, the younger cohort, were on their way to becoming professors. So they had started the process of becoming a professor. Everybody was contacted for an interview. Um, I think something like 70% agreed to interview. I'm sorry, there's something in the chat I just want to check out. Ah, no control group. There weren't enough people possible for a control group. You can imagine that the number of women in physics in general is quite small. For the pilot study, I used women in chemistry. Um, and that group, I've also published those findings, but that group I used as a pseudo control group for the interview schedule to validate those questions, and then also to identify particular issues that I wanted to bring up in the interviews. The interviews themselves were between 2 and 4 hours. And then there was a follow-up survey for all the questions that I couldn't get to in okay. You let me know, Fuss. And then for all of the questions I couldn't get to, I sent them out in a follow-up survey on SurveyMonkey. The data were collected for all surveys for each participant, and they were triangulated using a variety of different data that I collected. I then created narratives using identity and gender theory as my theoretical framework. So, the data that were collected were tripartite. So the interviews were in-depth, semi-structured life history interviews that, as I said, went anywhere between 2 and 4 hours. Although there was one interview that went on for 4.5 hours. I have no idea how I spoke that long with anybody, but we couldn't seem to stop. We really enjoyed each other's company. The follow-up survey, a lot of them were thought items, the items that I hadn't been able to get to in interview, but I also put in a reflection item so that the participants could think back on what they had said during the interview and then clarify anything that they thought they hadn't explained well or something that had stayed with them throughout the interview that they wanted to follow up on. And then last, I did a lot of research on the online presence that each of the participants had created. So there was a professional presence, their website, previous interviews, the papers that they had published, and then there was their private presence that was social media, the ways that they had decided to portray themselves, the identities, in essence, that they had created and cultivated online. I triangulated all these data to validate the qualitative data that I had collected. So the results. The first result that all of these women had in common that um, they performed in order to become successful was that they performed masculinity. So this quote is a nice little quote from Beth. She says, um, I guess at that point in my life, I was also more comfortable with guys in terms of the hobbies I had and the things I liked to do. Generally, more guys were doing them than girls were, like coding and trying to build things on the computer and video games. My brother and I took the Matchbox cars and the Legos and the Kinects. And what it doesn't say there, but she went on to say, is that her brother took the dollies and the Barbies and he played with them while she played with the boy toys. So every single participant associated themselves with boys in one way or another. And all of them adhered to the traits that Sandra Bem wrote about way back in the 70s. So they were all competitive. They were all aggressive. They all liked to innovate, to build. And then they all dissociated themselves with girls. So they talked about girls being catty or bitchy. They talked about girls saying they didn't have much in common with them. They found ways to associate themselves with boys and what boys like to do, and also dissociate with girls at the same time as they were performing these masculine associated traits. The next thing they did was they performed being antisocial. So as Eve says, we just worked Saturdays and Sundays because everybody else did, and there wasn't anything else to do, and your social life was work, really. So they perform this stereotype that people have about physicists, where physicists apparently avoid having social lives. They avoid friendships, even amongst other physicists. So they didn't really um, socialize with other people in the laboratory. Um, the only exception to this was when they talked about meeting their husbands, and every single one of these physicists identified as heteronormative. They all denied having, and believe me, I gave them enough room to say that they weren't heterosexual. I asked them pointedly, I said, "Did you date?" Didn't mention men, didn't mention anything about heterosexuality, and they were adamant about the fact that they met their husbands, not partners, not boyfriends, husbands, at particular times and particular kinds of social events. They also talked about the effect, to a certain extent, that this kind of antisocial behavior had on their home life, and as their identities as a wife and a mother. In the UK, there's a lot of emphasis placed on females performing these particular identities. To the point, Pasta and I were talking about this before we started um, recording, but in the UK, maternity leave is 6 months, paternity leave is 3 weeks. And so there's a lot of pressure put on females to be a mother and to be a wife. And it's not just when it comes to babies, although there's a lot of prejudice against any kind of formula. You breastfeed or you're a failure in this country. But also in terms of who cooks dinner. who cleans the house, who does the laundry. All the adverts, everything here is sort of biased that women should be doing all of this nurturing home life work, unpaid nurturing home life work. Caroline said, oh, sorry. Caroline said, pull this up. And I'd made the choice not to have a social life, as it were. I mean, never mind if we'd made the choice, I'd made the choice. And all the things I hadn't done, and I thought, did oh, sorry. Did I really have to work that hard? And really, did I have to shortchange the children? Um, all of the participants made it clear that they had made choices for themselves and their husbands, that they were the ones in charge, that they were the boss. And that, again, is a very masculinized identity. But it was the identity that they took as wives and mothers. The third trait that they all performed was being intellectually brilliant. And most of them did this as sort of a rule. I didn't ask them if they were smart. Um, it was never my intention to ask them what grades they received, but they all made sure to let me know that they had all received firsts. Do you guys have a system like that in Spain where, so at university, you get a pass, a third, a lower second, an upper second, or a first. And if you get a first, that means that you're at the top of your class. So all of them told me, without me asking, that they'd all gotten firsts. And then as they went back, they made sure to let me know at every point in their lives that they were brilliant. So Diane said, it was fairly clear I was academic. I was pretty bright. And Caroline said, I was boringly good at everything. They were very happy to own their own brilliance. One of them actually said, you have to cope with being so brilliant. It's not necessarily the kind of thing that other women in other fields might say. Some women might try to hide their brilliance or make it seem as though they're not more intelligent than the people around them. But these women were all very happy to be more intelligent than everybody else. They self-labeled as geeks or nerds or other terms. They liked calling themselves that because they felt that it enhanced this idea that they were incredibly brilliant. And they also received a lot of external acknowledgement for their intelligence, that they all quoted as being a part of their development into physicists. It wasn't external acknowledgement of how good they were at physics. It was external acknowledgement of their intelligence. And that, I think, is an important point. The last thing that they did was they created in their narrative this idea that they were born to be a physicist. It was a tautology of a kind. They didn't quote any kind of inspirational experience per se. It wasn't as though they went to a particular exhibit or they built something then said, I really like this. I want to do this forever. They just said, this is who I am. There was no other possibility for them than to be a physicist. So for Anne, she said, I was always someone who would break things down into their rational chunks and subdivide whatever problem I was up against. I think that kind of quite rational way of thinking is a good fit with physics, probably the kind of person who'd do physics if it was illegal. Beth said, from very young, it was clear to me that I enjoyed, I guess, science. I just didn't really know what science was. As thinking of myself as a scientist, part of it was just being curious about how the world works and how we interact with the world. So all the things I would try to learn about would be along that vein. So, what do all these data mean? The first thing that all of these people did, all the participants did, was to acknowledge to acknowledge the status quo and then reproduce it. They all performed some of the most well-known and well-practiced stereotypes that we have about physicists. They then adopted these stereotypes into their personalities. They began to embody them. So they embodied a certain kind of masculinity, not this sort of hegemonic masculinity, not like the big muscle, weightlifting kind of masculinity, but a physicist masculinity. And as they embodied it, they presented themselves in a different way to the way that other women might do. And I'm not saying that any of you are masculine in any way, although Jonathan, I'm sure you are. What I am saying is that they dressed a little differently. They did their hair a little differently. When I met them, none of them were very concerned necessarily about their appearance. None of them wore a lot of makeup or designer clothing. They were not necessarily beauty queens who had gone out of their way to appear um, hyper feminine. Instead, they were concerned about how people perceived them as physicists rather than as women. And so you see, the emphasis was always on them as physicists. And that in itself is a masculinized way of being, but it also shows how much they embodied all of these stereotypes. They also made it clear to me over and over and over again that they had established themselves not just within their professional life, but also in their personal lives as being just one of the guys. Any social lives they did have, which was not extensive by any means, was spent with males. They then also made it clear that they had elicited external esteem, meaning that they found ways and held on to those moments where they were recognized as being legitimate physicists, but also where they were finding legitimacy in being recognized as intelligent and capable. Now, if you go back to a paper that was put out by Corinne Moss-Rasmussen in, I think it was 2014, where she sent out identical CVs, one named Jane Doe and the other named John Doe, to see who would hire them and how they rated their competency and their efficiency. Males are always rated as higher, more competent, more efficient. Oh my goodness. There's a whole host of people there now. Hello. And so anytime anybody had complimented them or recognized them as competent and efficient and good at what they do, they held on to those moments. And then they used all of these stereotypes to reproduce the status quo, where they were, in a way, reifying those stereotypes as legitimate physicist identities. So how did they negotiate that conflict between their feminine identity and their physicist identity? The first thing that they did was to dissociate themselves from the hyper feminine, the really feminine girls. They were not girly girls. They very quickly disassociated themselves with boys from the time that they were young. They liked to play with boys' toys. They liked to get dirty. They liked to play rough. And all of these things help them to dissociate themselves from girls from the very beginning. The only exceptions they made were when they labeled themselves as wives and as mothers, and they did this with a certain amount of pride. Part of this, of course, is because of the context in which they were speaking. As I said, in the UK, there's a lot of pressure put on females to be wives and mothers, and so they took on those labels, but in a very specific way. None of them took the 6-month leave. They all talked about how they had those babies and then went right back to work as soon as they possibly could. Childcare was placed on their male partners. If they couldn't go back to work, and one of them went back to work within 2 weeks, which any of us who've had children know that's incredibly fast. No matter how much you have that maternal nugget in your head, the body needs time to recover. She was back at work in 2 weeks. She had one of her research assistants looking after the baby. And she even talked about putting the baby on the Xerox machine so it would sort of shake the baby to sleep. Yeah, crazy. Um, but they all talked about, I think about half of them had their husbands stay at home and take care of the child, where she went back to work. The ones that didn't reported being very resentful of their husbands for making them stay at home when they should have been back at work. And so they didn't associate themselves with that happy mother of the newborn identity that women are suspected to have. And instead, they associated themselves with that paternal identity of a newborn father, a father with a newborn, rather, where they do go back to work within 3 weeks in this country. And they're very happy to let the other half, the partner, take care of the child. They also reported that they worked late every night. It was their partner, their husband, who made dinner and cleaned the house and made sure that schedules were made for the children and all that other stuff that goes on at home. All that unpaid labor was done by their partner. And so, whereas they called themselves wives and mothers, they really took on a certain identity that's more associated with um, fathers and husbands. So while they did that, they associate themselves with the feminine, even though they're actually performing a kind of masculine form of the feminine. And as they perform that masculine identity of physics, the physicists rather, they created this hybrid identity where they could be a wife and a mother, albeit masculinized wife and mother, and a physicist at the same time. It's rare to talk to a male physicist who talks about taking time off with a newborn. And so doing that alone gave them this sort of hybrid identity where they were redoing femininity in physics and making it a possibility where it had not been before. Neither their masculine performance nor their feminine performance was a complete performance, meaning that you couldn't necessarily look at any of these participants and say, you are 100% femininized. You're not. They performed that masculinity and embodied it so well that they would have a gender identity that's somewhere between the ideal feminine and the ideal masculine anyway. Neither of those performances was a complete on one side masculine or completely feminine. And developing this new kind of physicist identity that allows them to be wives and mothers creates a new available identity within physics. They have these cohesive identities because they have redone gender within physics for this small niche identity. And that was how they claimed that they found success in physics. They could climb to this elite place because they had embodied all of these masculinized identities. They could be elite and be feminine because they had, in essence, masculinized even the most feminine of identities. And really, there's very little that's more feminized than being a mother. So what does this mean for young female physicists? I could talk about that young female physicists need to negotiate their gender identities and become masculinized, but that's really not fair to anybody. Really, what we need to do is address the problem at its root. And one of the problems we have is that the epistemology of physics, it's just so masculinized and so outdated, really. Why are we searching for truth? It's an end game. It's what we should find at the end. What we should really be interested in is the process. It's about trying to find something that understands what we're looking at rather than some truth that might never be reached. And finding understanding is something that's more gender neutral than searching for some truth that may or may not exist. We should also be able to create a pathway in physics that does not in any way require anyone to negotiate not just their gender identity, but maybe their sexuality identity, because that's also problematic, or any other kind of identity. Nobody should have to negotiate anything in order to find that they have an available physics identity. And in order to do that, we have to make space in physics for a broader range of available identities. We have to be more inclusive. And in doing so, we have to believe that everybody is capable, is competent, is intelligent. We have to get rid of endemic biases, endemic discrimination, and most importantly, unconscious biases that lead us to believe that certain people belong in physics and others do not. Women are more than capable of becoming physicists and becoming incredibly successful elite physicists with international fame. We should aim to that. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I'd like to open up for questions.
Thank you very much. It was very amazing talk because of you show us the interviews with colleagues that really they feel like reproducing this stereotype of masculine. So
Mhm.
it's some kind of some depress for us as women, but okay. Oh, let's say something. So we have some time now for an open talk with some question that you want to ask Jaimie. Do some of you just simply talk and or raise your hand? Do we have any questions?
How many of you felt like I was talking about you?
Yeah. Yeah, myself many times. Yes, yes.
It's okay to admit it. I
Yeah, we
mean,
have
not
that.
everything necessarily might be something that resonates with you, but did anybody feel like they've been antisocial and not had social lives in order to become good at physics?
Yeah, well, I have one question
Mhm.
because well, I think that in Spain we are probably maybe we are more women than in UK, no, isn't it?
Yeah.
We maybe we so and it's important to see that there's other women in your room because if you are alone, it's then to survive you need to be with like them. It's
Mhm.
mimetism because if not in this but I would like all this association of women that we are involved, that we will also have to do is to put the focus on the male. This is my now because we have to destroy that physics. Okay, physics is a male dominated. And then what we are saying is that if you want to be a woman that has access in in this world, you need to be like them. So we are reproducing the same as you show in this paper. You are reproducing the same. But let's focus on the male and the feminine part of the male, that being
Mhm.
that be child care, that be all these feminine aspects, and then mm, mm, put in value these aspects because and then other women can maybe identify because it's amazing that you need to rethinking your gender if you want to succeed in your professional life is something
It's
really.
crazy. I agree. I think that's a really good point. They should focus more on the feminized part of the males.
Yes, yes.
But keep in mind too that some of these participants are not going to say they're older. They're older, um, but they're some of these women were the only female
Yeah.
in the room. Um, a couple of them were the only female in physics at their university, and the first female faculty in physics when they came to that point. One of them talked about how there was no female toilet in the building. And so when she first started teaching, or when she first took up her faculty position, she had to run a half mile to the next available female toilet. which seems ridiculous. I mean, it's a toilet, right? Everybody should be able to go. But no, no, there was no female toilet. Um, so when those women were creating their identities, they did what they had to do and they masculinized their identities in order to fit in. There was no other option for them.
Yeah,
The women who came up after them did base a lot of who they were on those first women. And so they did use the role models that were there, but because those role models had created these redone gender identities, that's what the younger women did as well. But I think you're right. If they could see the men as feminized, or if the males in physics could show their more feminine traits, then it might be a win for everybody.
yeah, yeah. I don't know if in the audience there's more younger physicists or that they.
I should clarify too that when I say younger versus older, the
Okay.
people in this cohort were anywhere from 35 to 75 years old. So the people that I'm saying are older, those would be the people between 65 and 75, who strangely are still working in one way or another, even though they're not supposed to in this country. The younger women, one was 30, you know, 30 to 45 were the younger.
Yeah, yeah. Also, they're younger. Any question that you want to ask, or you want, or some comment that you want to say, or in Spanish? Because Jaimie, it's their parents were from Argentina, and you understand the Spanish some
Pero,
or
despacio.
despacio. Si queréis, podéis preguntar en castellano. Ella la entiende. Some
Pero no catalán.
o catalana. Yeah. Any other? I think that we are
Oh
good.
no, have I made you all depressed? No,
I am very depressed, yes.
no, don't be sad.
Hi, Jamie.
Hola,
Hola.
Hola.
No sé si se
nada.
me oye.
Yo quería hacer un breve, no, bueno, primero agradecerle la magnífica presentación
Oh, gracias.
que nos, vamos, en muchos aspectos yo creo que todas nos sentimos un poco identificadas, ¿no? Con muchas de estas, de lo que, bueno, de los resultados de esas entrevistas. Pero de todos modos, bueno, ya lo dijo Paz. Yo creo que la situación que tenemos en España, con ser complicada, no es tanto como en otros países europeos, por lo menos, no sé en Estados Unidos, pero yo creo que, bueno, es cierto que nuestros compañeros varones en general, o que la imagen de la física es muy masculina, ¿no? Porque se asocia con esa brillantez y esa especie de, casi es un sacerdocio, es decir, es una religión. ¿M? Entonces nosotras somos como más superficiales o nos consideran como que no estamos tan involucradas en el descubrimiento científico y ese tipo de cosas, ¿no? Pero en cualquier caso, yo creo que aquí en España mm, lo tenemos un poco mejor o quizás está más suavizado mm, digamos, esa male-dominated situation, ¿no?
Yeah.
Y de hecho aquí estamos, bueno, en el grupo de mujeres en física, pues bueno, estamos bastantes mujeres. Es cierto que también conocemos a muchas que adoptan la forma de ser absolutamente masculina, pero en todos con todas sus consecuencias, ¿no? Y que de alguna forma les parece que nosotras estamos aquí para, bueno, que no es necesaria la existencia de un grupo de mujeres en física que luche por bueno, por los derechos y
Mhm.
bueno, y cambiar la perspectiva de la física.
Mhm.
De todos modos, mi pregunta, o bueno, no sé si pregunta, pero el problema que yo veo aquí es que la imagen que transmitimos sigue siendo la de una disciplina absolutamente dominada por esa imagen masculina. Entonces eso hace que las chicas no estudien física, es decir, las más jóvenes tienen esa idea de la física como algo, ¿no? Complicado, difícil, solo para mentes muy brillantes. Y yo no sé cómo podemos cambiar eso, porque, bueno, de alguna forma estamos intentando cambiarlo, pero no, parece que la imagen que transmitimos no conseguimos que llegue a las más jóvenes. No sé cómo lo ves tú.
Es un problema, no, not just in Spain, everywhere. Um, in the UK, um, if you ask girls if they want to go into physics, they'll say, I'm not smart enough.
Ujú.
Um, and all over the world, they've done these draw a scientist tests. If you ask them what a physicist looks like, pretty much everyone draws Albert Einstein. That's not fair. It shouldn't be. Um, but yeah, like you said, there's this vision of what a physicist should be. How do we change that? Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is change that epistemology of physics. Make it a search for understanding rather than a search for truth. Um, and Einstein never said he was looking for truth. He was just, honestly, he was antisocial because he probably was autistic. It wasn't that he looked to be antisocial. Um, it wasn't that he asked to be seen as brilliant. The fact was he couldn't associate with people in any other way. He had social issues. He was probably autistic. And so if we're basing the entirety of the physics identity on Einstein, I think that becomes problematic. And it has been problematic for, 80 years. Time to change that. And I think the first thing we do is start talking about understanding rather than what's true. Other than that, I think we just have to keep encouraging girls, not just girls, anyone who's not a boy, any gender that's not boy. I think we need to encourage them every single time they do or say anything good, they need to know.
Yeah.
Ujú.
We have a question of Marta. Do you want to try if your microphone is working?
Hi,
Mm.
Hola.
hola. No sé si
Hola.
se me oye.
Sí, se te oye perfecto, Marta.
¿Ah, sí?
Sí.
Ah, pensé que no. Eh, bueno, thank you, Jamie, for this talk. I'm super interested and it's super interesting. I just wanted to know about the reactions while you were in the process of the interview, because considering they're mostly old people, I guess this was kind of challenging for them. Or I also wanted to know if they have read these The Truth of the Earth, what the reactions were.
So I approached the interviews from a feminist standpoint. So I made it clear that even though they are normally during an interview, there's a power differential. The interviewer has all of the power and the participant has none. And so instead of doing that, I made it clear that they had as much power as I did, and we were creating the narrative together. I was very encouraging and very open, but I also listened very carefully. Most of them had never had the opportunity to speak about their experiences and for it to be anonymous. So they were actually very happy to open up and to speak about things that they hadn't said before. It took a while for some of them to stop using the same terms that they had used over and over and over again in previous interviews, whether it be for print or for audio interviews on radio, because a lot of them have been interviewed a lot. And so they tend to answer with the same sort of pat answer. And it took me questioning that to get beyond it. So one of them, for example, had made it seem in all of her interviews that she was the first in her family to go to university. And she gave me the same answer that she normally gives. And when I said to her, you know, when you said that in this interview and that interview, I questioned it because you just said that your grandfather went to Cambridge. And she stopped for a second. She said, "Oh, did I make it seem that way?" I said, "Yes." And then all of a sudden, everything that she had said before in interviews was off the table. She was completely honest and open, knowing that I had A, done my research, and B, was there to listen without judgment. Most of them reacted to the interviews themselves as a relief. For once, they've been able to say all the things that had been bothering them, all the things that they wanted to say without any judgment on them, and knowing that it wouldn't hurt them or their careers in any way. I have not heard back from them since this paper was published. Some of them might not even know that they were the participants in this study. And I hope they never figure it out, because that to me would mean that I'd kept them as anonymous as possible. Does that answer your question, Martha?
Sure, thank you. And I also wanted to know, I don't know if this is a little bit mean to ask, but how many of them said no to the interview?
2 said no to interviews.
So they replied to
Yes.
the proposal. Okay.
The first one replied straight away and said, "I'm sorry, I don't have time for this." Oh, sorry, three. The first one replied straight away and said, "I'm sorry, I don't have time for this." The other 2, I had wanted for specific reasons, but they didn't reply at all. And then I used some contacts who happened to know them and had them write and say, "Can you please write back to Jaimie and let her know?" And one of them was kind of not so nice about it. And then the other was very kind about it, but neither one of them had the time at the moment. At that point in time, the UK had started doing this campaign for diversity, and they had billboards, you know, those large like posters above buildings on almost every university campus where they were photographing women and people who are not white and putting them up on those billboards and saying, "This is physics at whatever university." And so those people who said no to the interviews, the reason that they had said no was because they were either being interviewed to go on the university website or they were being photographed and filmed for university marketing purposes to be on the billboards.
That's interesting that they have done
Crazy.
that in universities.
No,
That's
it was
awesome.
it was odd. It was very odd. They're still up for the most part. And they try to, University of Birmingham, for example, when they do their This is Physics poster, they put up everybody who's won any kind of an ERC award or have somehow done something good internationally. So it's usually males and females who go up on there, but they always make sure to have a woman and someone who's non-white on the poster.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we are just 1 hour. I don't want to waste your time, and I think that if there's no more question, isn't it? We just can conclude. Again, thank you, Jaimie, for this fantastic talk, and we hope that we will be together in in presence and someday.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for your work, and continue, please, giving these papers and this talk, because we need really these social studies. We need it, and we have to know, and everybody should know these results. So thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you, really. Thanks.
Thank
Okay.
you so much for having me. If anybody has any questions, please do email me. I would love to talk to you.
This will be recorded, so now I stop